Hi. Welcome to you, and yes, you too. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how to sew together this Dolman Kimono dress. In my previous video, I showed you how to make the pattern for this dress, so be sure to check that video out first before watching this video. Now, if I wasn't working 8 to 5, I can literally finish sewing this dress in half a day. The total amount of seams you need to sew for this dress is about 11 seams, and then you also need to hem the dress. Now, my design for this dress started off as a loosely fitted dress. However, somewhere along the line, I went ahead and held the waist and decided that maybe I should add some versatility in the form of the belt, and hence the belt design. So I like the dress with the belt and without the belt. Either way works just fine for me. Alright then, let's go ahead and get started. But before we do, let's do a quick check. 1, that you're subscribed. 2, that your notification is turned on. And also, give this video as many likes as you can if you want to see more of these kind of videos from me. And let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. My name is Ijoma, and welcome to my sewing diary. The materials you will need are your completed manipulated kimono dolman dress pattern, pins, fabric scissors, sewing thread, fabric of choice. I used about 3 yards of this slightly stretchy crepe fabric, some interface. Now you'll only need very little for the facing and cuff, so that's less than half a yard. Tailors chalk, safety pin and measuring tape. I'll leave the full list as well as all associated links in the description box below. Cut your fabric according to the instructions on your pattern. As mentioned, you'll only be cutting your facings and cuff on interface. For the cuff, I'll be fusing the interface on only one side of each cuff, and so I'll only cut 2 pieces of interface for the cuff, but this is purely optional. Then make 1/8 of an inch wide notch marks according to the asterisk marks and at all seam intersections on your cut fabric. Starting with the front pieces, place right side on right side and pin the pieces together until you get to the start of the bottom slit. Then stitch all pinned areas with a half-inch seam allowance to this point and press your seam allowance open afterwards. Then with right side on right side, pin your front and back pieces at the shoulder line only and sew all pinned areas with a half-inch seam allowance, pressing your seam allowance open afterwards. Set this aside while we prepare the facing. Fuse your interface on your front and back facing pieces, and then with right side on right side, pin your front facing pieces together at the center front, stopping at the beginning of the front slit. Sew all pinned areas with a half-inch seam allowance and press your seam allowance open afterwards.
Then go ahead and join the front facing to the back facing at the shoulder line by pinning them together right side on right side. So all pinned areas will have seam allowance, and press your seam allowance open afterwards. With right side on right side and matching notches, join your facing and main pieces together at the neckline with pins, and then sew all pinned areas with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. When you're done, make notch marks close to the stitch line all through the neckline, and then trim the seam allowance to 1/4 inch, understitching the trim seam allowance to the facing fabric when you're done. Set this aside. Onto the cuff. Like I said earlier on, I wanted to fuse only one side of my cuff with interface, but you can fuse both sides if you want. So first, join the cuffs together at the breadth, that is the longest part, with pins, and with right side on right side. So all pinned areas with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and press your seam allowance open afterwards. Next, fold and press your seam allowance at all 4 edges to the wrong side. And then, with your garment open at the side line, go ahead and join the cuff to the bodice with pins by placing right side on right side and with the bulk of the cuff on the garment. Sew all pinned areas with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then, with right side on right side and matching all notches, go ahead and pin the side of the front and back pieces together, including the cuff, and sew all pinned areas with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, pressing your seam allowance open afterwards. We will then be finishing the cuff by stitching in the ditch. So fold your cuff so that the pressed folded unsewn seam allowance at the top covers the bottom sewn seam allowance, and then hold it together with pins. You're going to be stitching in the stitch line of the front cuff to capture the back at about 1/8 of an inch. I've shown you how to stitch in the ditch in one of my previous videos. I'll leave the link and the timestamp in the description box below. Complete the joining of the facing to the main at the bottom by pinning the open ends of the main and facing pieces together, right side on right side. Sew all pinned areas with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, trim the seam allowance, and then understitch the trim seam allowance to the facing only. Give this part a good press with your steam iron afterwards, and then go ahead and clean out your raw edges. Then, with your tailor's chalk, first mark 1/2 inch in from the hem and a further 1 inch in. Then fold and pin at the 1/2 inch mark. Press down to create fold lines, and then further fold and pin over the 1 inch mark, pressing down with your steam iron to keep in place. Sew the hem with a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance at the inner edge, giving it a good press afterwards, and you're pretty much done. So I decided to add extra details in the form of belt loops and a belt, so the next following steps are purely optional. Cut a long enough length of fabric, 2 times the width of how you want yours to be, plus 1 inch for seam allowance. I wanted a 3 inch wide belt, so I cut a long strip of fabric 7 inches wide. And then fold the long piece into 2 and press with your steam iron. At the shorter edge, also fold 1/2 inch in on the wrong side and press down. When sewing together, you'll be leaving one edge open with its 1/2 inch seam allowance turned like so, and then stitching the long edge and the other shorter edge closed with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Trim your seam allowance at the sewn edges, and then turn your belt inside out. When you're done, pin the open edge shut and stitch close with a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. For the loops, cut 2 2 inches wide strips. Length should be the same as the width of the main belt plus 1 inch, so mine was 4 inches long and 2 inches wide. Fold in 2 and press down. Then stitch the length down with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, trim your seam allowance, and then turn inside out with a safety pin like so.
Then, with your needle and thread, and on each side of the completed dress, just underneath where the dolman sleeve starts, go ahead and stitch the loops on the side line like so. And you're done! This dress came out very well, if I do say so myself. Let me know if you have any questions whatsoever in the comment section, and do not forget to subscribe, turn on your notification, and like this video. Until next week, see you later. Bye.